Hello, welcome to another episode of the Stars podcast series Shattered Lives, which is focusing on the ongoing murder trial of Gerry Hutch. My name is Michael O'Toole and I'm the paper's crime correspondent. Jonathan Dowdall has now completed his evidence after 8 gruelling days on the witness stand at the Special Criminal Court. He is the main witness in the case against Gerry Hutch, who is also known as the Monk. Now, this may sound repetitive, but it is important. Mr. Hutch is on trial at the non-jury court where he is charged with the murder of David Byrne at the Regency Airport Hotel in Dublin on the 5th of February 2016. He denies the charge. 2 other men, Jason Bonney and Paul Murphy, are also on trial. They are accused of helping a crime gang to carry out the murder by providing it with cars, but they are not charged with the murder itself. Like Mr. Hutch, they deny the charges. Joining me now to discuss the trial is the Star's chief reporter Paul Healy.
How's it going, Mick?
So, 8 days of evidence done for Mr. Dowdall. I presume he was relieved, and I presume everybody in the court, including yourself, was relieved when it was over.
Absolutely. It's been it's been entertaining, but it's been a long couple of days. But Jonathan Dowdall for sure was relieved. The very last sentence that he said, the last utterance from Jonathan Dowdall today was, "Is it over now?" Almost a disbelief, I think, on his part. Is it over now? It was quite clearly over. I mean, Mr. Graham had said to him, "Thank you, Mr. Dowdall," and he sat down and that was the last sentence anyway, and he was able to leave the room.
I'm struggling to remember anybody, a witness who's been on the stand that length of time. I mean, it's usually 1, maybe 2 days, but look, I mean, I'm sure there have been, but in the cases I've covered, and that's more than a few, I don't really remember, outside tribunals, I don't really remember in criminal cases anybody being on the stand that length of time, so it must have been completely draining for him.
I can only imagine. I mean, look, we've been talking the whole way through this, how he has been extremely frustrated and continued to ask every day, how much longer am I going to be here? As I say, I think it got to the point now where he was nearly in disbelief that it was all finally over today. I think there was a potential that it could have gone on for longer, but one key thing happened today, and maybe it's worth talking about this first, actually, because we all thought that today was the day that Mr. Graham, defending for Hutch, was going to play a tape that Jonathan Dowdall had somebody make of him torturing a man in his home, Alexander Healy. That's something he spent a bit of time in prison for, as we know. He says this man was trying to defraud him. He had put an ad up on Dundee in relation to a bike. This guy came over. He felt that he was trying to defraud him and take money from him. And so he made the decision to torture and waterboard this fella and have a person in his household film the whole ordeal. And throughout this, Mr. Graham has come back to him about it again and again and again. And today he said he wasn't satisfied with the answers he'd gotten from Mr. Dowdall about that. And he felt that he had no choice but to play the tape because he needed to put it to Dowdall directly. But this was objected to by the prosecution. Prosecuting Counsel Sean Gillane objected to it and said there was no basis, no reason for it to be played. It had nothing to do with the charge before the court. And Mr. Dowdall had already answered at length about it and taken ownership of it and apologised for what happened and served his time in prison for it. And ultimately a ruling was made by the judges. They sided with the prosecution on that fact, that Mr. Dowdall has already explained it, and it has no evidential value in relation to what we're hearing before the court, the charge against Mr. Hutch.
Sorry, Paul, can I just clarify or just ask, what was the defence's, did the defence give a rationale for wanting the video and audio to be played?
I think the rationale was that Jonathan Dowdall, they weren't satisfied with his answers in relation to it, and in particular, Mr. Graham's position was that Dowdall will answer things when he's, I suppose, caught on tape in relation to it, or when there's clear evidence that it's happened. He'll answer questions about it, but when there's doubt over particular elements, then he won't answer questions about it, or he'll divert the subject. And I think there was an issue where Mr. Healy had made allegations about what had happened prior to even being shown the tape, and Mr. Dowdall had made allegations about things that he said did and didn't happen that weren't filmed on the tape, and he admitted to the things that were on the tape because he couldn't explain them away, I suppose. So I think he was just trying to catch him on that issue of, you've no objection to this, no issue with this because you're caught on tape with it. But when it comes to everything else, you'll lie, you'll explain it away, etc. So I think it was to help his argument, to boost his argument that you can't trust a word this guy says, I suppose. But the judges didn't side with it. They didn't see any reason for this video to be played. So I think that could have been what that to the original question. That could have been what delayed us and brought us into January. If that had been played, we would have been still talking about Dowdall into January.
Can we just clarify one thing? I'm slightly confused. Nobody knew outside the victim and the aggressor. Nobody knew about the waterboarding incident until the Garda Special Branch raided Dowdall's house and found the memory stick. There hadn't been any complaint or nobody knew about it. So in other words, if Dowdall hadn't videoed that or hadn't kept the memory stick, he probably would have got away with it.
Yes, and that's been put to him by Brendan Grehan that, when he went on to the Joe Duffy show, he didn't think that anybody knew about it or anyone would ever find out about it. Because, he says, I've no involvement in criminality. He now accepts that he might be classed as a criminal because of what he did to Alex Hurley. But Mr. Grehan has put it to him repeatedly. You've only said that because you got caught, we got found out. But yeah, it's worth, to answer your question, Mr. Hurley apparently didn't come forward to the Gardaí. There were issues in relation to him, and Mr. Dowdall said that he didn't come forward because there were issues about him defrauding people, and that he was serving a suspended sentence in relation to something else, and so Mr. Hurley didn't want to go to the Gardaí because of that. But there were other claims that on Mr. Hurley's part for Mr. Hurley that perhaps he was living in fear because Mr. Dowdall had threatened him that he was in the IRA and that they'd feed him to the dogs if he ever came forward, and so that that perhaps was the real reason why Mr. Hurley wasn't so eager to come to Gardaí, because he was in fear for his life. And
waterboarding would do that to you. I mean, I'm not being facetious. If you are waterboarded, you would be in fear for your life afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I look, I mean, whatever Mr. Dowdall's explanation for, this man was trying to defraud me or whatever, you can't get away from the crime that was committed here. Now, he says he's taken full ownership of that. He says he served his time for it. He went to prison, and he says he dealt with it. And obviously the court agrees to a degree that he had been grilled enough on that and explained it enough that we didn't need to see the tape. So that was a huge issue. We thought it was going to be played today, but it ultimately wasn't.
Can we just go back to earlier today? I understand, as we said before, when Jonathan Dowdall first took when Brendan Grehan, senior counsel for Gerry Hutch, first started cross-examining Jonathan Dowdall, the first words he said to him was that he was a double liar. Now, I understand that there were accusations this morning that he was lying again.
Yeah, he denied that he was lying about this, this confession in the park in Whitehall. It was put to him again by Mr. Grehan that he was lying about that. And we'll come back to that because things wrapped up today in relation to that meet-up in the park and the timings of it. And this is possibly the most interesting thing that happened today, but I'll come back to that. I just want to mention something that we talked about on the podcast yesterday. It's just come to my attention that there was a quote from Jonathan Dowdall about "Yous never did the Regency." Got a bit more context to that because we played that transcript in full today, and it was in the context of Dowdall was talking to Hutch on the transcript about what he might say to the Kinahans, and he was saying that you would say to the Kinahans, "Yous never did the Regency." I know that's... He would say, "Yous never knew, yous never did the Regency," and I know that's a lie, but, and I know it's a bit ridiculous, but you'd suggest to them that yous never did the Regency. And you can hear Mr. Hutch say in response that he doesn't think it should be said who done what in any proposed meet-up with Daniel Kinahan, the Kinahans, any proposed peace deal. Another interesting thing that came out of the talk about the peace deal, which I thought was interesting, was that perhaps the younger Hutches might not accept it. In particular, that Patrick Jr. Might feel betrayed by Gerry Hutch if there's talks about a ceasefire, about a kind of a peace deal. That was just something that was of interest to me from those tapes.
And that's an interesting point, Paul, because just separate to the trial, covering this feud since, well, we all know it started in 2015 with the murder of Gary Hutch, but before that there was the attempt in 2014 to murder Daniel Kinahan. So, it's been going on 8 years, more than 8 years really. And one of the things that I've always been conscious of is, the Young Turks, because there are young, aggressive people on both sides who won't let this lie. I know we can talk about this later in the other part when we're answering questions, but that is an issue that there are, you have wiser, older heads, and then you have young ones who won't listen and who are reckless and who are aggressive. So that is a fair point.
Yeah, just on this subject, there's another thing we're talking about. It might sound a little bit boring, but the reason why it's crucial, I'll explain. But there is a sentence from Jonathan Dowdall about, um, I'll just get the exact quote, that it was used in the Regency. He's saying, did you say it to the lads up north when you were talking to them, that it was used in the Regency? Initially, he says that it was you in the Regency. And Gerry Hutch says, what? And then Dowdall says, well, obviously they thought it was you if you were giving them the guns, the AK-47s, the yokes as they're referred to in the tape. And then there's like an yeah or something from Gerry Hutch. And again, then he says, well, you didn't say that it was used in the Regency. And he was grilled on this today, what do you mean by use? And he accepted that he meant the Hutches, the Hutch gang. And I think Mr. Grehan was really spending a bit of time on this because he's saying, when you're saying use, you mean the Hutches. When you're saying you're saying you mean Gerry Hutch. And the key to that is that the prosecution are effectively saying that what Mr. Hutch says in response to this may well be a confession, because Gerry Hutch says something like, he knows, yeah. So they're talking about this meeting up north. Dowdall is asking, did you tell them it was used in the Regency? And Hutch says something like, he knows, yeah. And the prosecution might make a bit of an argument about that this is potentially caught on tape, a confession from Gerry Hutch. And that's why Mr. Grehan spent a bit of time on it today, because I think we've already heard him allege that Gerry Hutch is hard of hearing. And so he says what an awful lot. So there's an implication here that perhaps Gerry Hutch didn't fully understand what Jonathan Dowdall was asking him. So I think that was just something interesting that happened in the morning.
And so if I'm hearing it correctly, there's a difference between you and use. So, this is great because this is my love of crime and love of language coming together. So you is obviously singular and use in Dublin parlance would be plural.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So use, he acknowledged he meant the Hutches, and you was Gerry Hutch. But the difference is when he asks him about you, Hutch says what, and when he says about use, Hutch says yeah, he knows. It might seem like a small thing. There's a 10-hour tape. It's a very small exchange between the two men, but the prosecution are alleging that on this tape there is potentially a confession from Gerry Hutch recorded, and that may become a huge part of their case, because the other part of their case is an allegation by Jonathan Dowdall that Hutch confessed to him in a park, and obviously there's no tape for that. The only thing that they have for that is Jonathan Dowdall's word. But again, I'll come back to that, I suppose, at the end of things. So when we finally got to around lunchtime, we finally got to the end of the tapes. Mr. Grehan said to Jonathan Dowdall they were done. You might be relieved to know that we're done with the audio now, Mr. Dowdall. So when we came back from lunch, then we fully expected that we were going to have this torture video played. But as I've mentioned already, there was legal argument about that, and the judges decided that it should not be played. So then a really bizarre thing, I felt it was bizarre thing happened. We were going to listen to the Joe Duffy show. We were going to listen to an extract of Jonathan Dowdall's interview on Joe Duffy just after his home had been raided in March of 2016. And it starts off literally, good afternoon, you're welcome to Liveline, and the music plays. And it's just bizarre because you're sitting in this tense courtroom and everyone's sitting there listening to the Liveline music, which is quite lively, and it was just bizarre. It was like all of a sudden we're just all sitting there listening to RT radio. But anyway, we got into it. I won't propose to talk about this for very long because people are probably very familiar with this interview, but Dowdall insists that he's not involved in any criminality, any crime, and he's an ordinary decent citizen respected in the community, and he doesn't understand why the guards have raided his home. and he moans a bit about a vehicle being taken. Oh, they took the flashy vehicle and they put it on the back of the van, and he complains about the media knowing about it, and he complains that his life is effectively over. All of that was played to him in some detail, but really Mr. Grehan was challenging him in relation to, when he ultimately was being talked to by the guards later that year. He clammed up when he was being asked about Alex Hurley, when they put it to him about Alex Hurley, when they knew about it. You clammed up. So he basically said, I'll get the quote, but he had said, contrary to your performance on Joe Duffy, you clammed up when the guards were trying to talk to you. You thought you could ride it out by going on Joe Duffy, by playing the indignant victim of a plot. But once the Gardaí started to challenge you, you clam up, you say nothing. He said, the man who can't shut up on Joe Duffy can't say anything when challenged by the guards. Look, we've gone through this kind of already, but he wanted to kind of play it to him and get his reaction. I just thought that was a very interesting portion of the day. That was this afternoon. It's just something that stemmed from that I thought was insightful. Was we got a little bit of an insight, I suppose, into Dowdall's mindset about his future. We know that he's going to go in potentially to the witness protection program, will have to leave the country and that. But it was put to him that when the guards questioned him about Alex Hurley, he knew his life was over. And Dowdall said, well, there could have been some hope before this murder charge. And Mr. Grehan said, well, that's exactly it. But Dowdall kind of got annoyed about that and interrupted and said, no, look, I'll always rebuild my life. He said, no matter if I have to dig up dog shite cleaning a kennel, I'll rebuild my life. So, he's still steadfast in that position of his that he thinks that he will be able to rebuild his life after all of this. Just thought that was fascinating.
Well, he will. Now, he won't have to dig up dog shite because he will have a new identity. And he won't have a criminal record or won't have anything. He will have a new life. So, as you always say with the witness security program, if he gets on it, it's the equivalent to what he has now. So his life that he had here, it'll be similar to what his life is over there, right? But he'll have a new life, and I don't think he'll be having to dig up dog do.
Yeah, I just thought it was an interesting exchange. I mean, we didn't get too much of an insight into his mindset now about his future, so I just thought that was worth. Just another thing before I move on, again, a throwaway line, but I mean, it sort of shocked me. Dowdall was being asked about why, clamming up to the Gardaí and not saying anything. He disclosed that when he was in Wheatfield prison, he said that he'd heard about the guards being outside Jason Bonney's house, and he'd heard about Paul Murphy. Briefly, just to explain, Jason Bonney, Paul Murphy are also accused before the court. They're not accused of murder, they're accused of facilitating the murder by providing vehicles, and they deny that charge. But Dowdall alleges that he heard in prison that if Jason Bonney and Paul Murphy, if any of them pleaded guilty, he said, they'd be shot. And he was indicating this in terms of why he couldn't speak himself and why he felt at that point in time he was not able to defend himself, because he was being challenged about another quote that he gave, another thing that he said to his psychologist, that if he went to court in October, I would be found guilty of murder, he said to his psychologist. And he said in court today, well, that's because he couldn't defend himself, obviously in fear for his life, and he makes this claim. We don't know if it's true or not, but he makes this claim that if Bonney or Murphy pleaded guilty, they'd be shot. That's what he was told. He was
obviously in prison at the stage, and he would have been on what we'd call the Hutch landing. But did he give any indication who told him or who said that or who he heard it from?
No, we moved on from that. Brendan Grehan obviously didn't want to ask him about that. He brought that up himself, and as I said, throughout this trial, sometimes Dowdall says things, it's not necessarily answered the question. Mr. Grehan is always trying to lead him back to the question, so he didn't spend much more time on that. And there's throwaway lines throughout this that we have to kind of pick and go, oh, that's interesting, it was said and we moved on.
Sorry, Paul. Just one thing that struck me as interesting is phone records around the time of this vaunted meeting in the park in which Dowdall alleges that Gerry Hutch confessed to the murder. So that would have been on the 8th of February in Whitehall in North Dublin.
Maybe. What this is the most interesting thing that happened today, and it happened right at the end. Obviously, Mr. Grehan was waiting to, I suppose, hit Jonathan Dowdall with his final questions on the central allegation that Gerry Hutch confessed to him in this park in Whitehall days after the Regency. And he put it to Mr. Dowdall that in his interviews with Gardaí several times, he alleged that this meeting happened between 11 a.m. and midday on the 8th of February, Monday the 8th of February, the same day that Eddie Hutch, a brother of the accused, was murdered.
Which is a memorable day. I mean, it's a few days after the Regency, and it's a few hours before Eddie Hutch, whom he knew, was murdered. So it is a memorable day. It is a day that would stay in your memory.
Yeah, well, Mr. Grehan said it, these are kind of two very significant events that happened in your life, and it should be very clear in your mind. But Jonathan Dowdall, I will explain this now, but once certain things were put to him, he started to cast doubt on exactly when it happened. He said that he wasn't sure whether it was the Sunday, the 7th of February, or whether it was the Monday, the 8th of February. He believed it was the Monday, the 8th, but he wasn't sure. And he said that after it was put to him that a phone analyst had been brought in to kind of confirm his whereabouts at the time. And his phone was found to be pinging off a mast near the Navan Road. At the time was 11:58 on the Monday, the 8th of February. And then after that...
And he lives... Sorry,
yes,
Paul, he lives
there.
In the Navan Road area.
Yes, he lives there. And then it pinged off an area in Dundalk after 1 p.m. And that caused Jonathan Dowdall to interject and said, well, then it obviously wasn't the 8th, was it? It wasn't the 8th then, wasn't it? Mr. Grehan put it to him, well, you're the one constantly telling the Gardaí that it happened on the 8th. And he says that he received a phone call from Kay, the wife of Patsy Hutch, on the evening of the 8th. She told him that Eddie Hutch had just been shot dead. And he can remember that. And in fact, the phone analyst was able to corroborate that phone call, or that a phone call occurred shortly after 8 p.m. It's 20 past 8, I think, on the evening of the 8th from Kay to Jonathan Dowdall. So Mr. Grehan put it to him, well, obviously that's been corroborated to an extent that you had a phone call there. Yet the records show that you appear to have been in the Navan Road area and Dundalk when you said you were in the park in Whitehall with Gerry Hutch. And then, when it comes to the Sunday, now this may throw things a little bit back in Jonathan Dowdall's favour to a degree, although there's a contrast still. But his phone did ping off a mast in the Whitehall area of Dublin on the Sunday, the 7th. But at a completely different time, at 3:16 p.m. that day in Whitehall. And then Dowdall said, oh, well then, that must have been the time. But he insisted, look, my recollection was, he said, this is years ago, and 7 years ago, but my recollection always was that it happened in the morning. But he says, he actually said, you have me confused here, Mr. Grehan. But he said, look, it could have been the 7th, it could have been the 8th. His recollection was that it happened in the morning, but if the phone was pinging off the mast at 3:16 p.m, then maybe that's the time it was. And Mr. Grehan said, well, are we going to move the time? Are we, just to suit your record, to suit the record? We're going to move the time now, are we?
And there's one, maybe we should just remind people of this. Jonathan Dowdall is a state witness. In other words, the prosecution are still, have had all their witnesses. So the prosecution, now that this is done, will call another. They have the right to call other witnesses. You and I don't know. There's no list that we're given every day. But it could well be that there will be a data analyst from the Garda Síochána who'll do the cell-side analysis and show, yes, this, and this. But that's all up in the air because we, as I say, we don't have the list and we don't know what's coming next.
Yeah. Well, look, Dowdall was insistent upon this, that he was telling the truth. And Mr. Grehan finished this argument up by saying, well, all we have really is your say-so, that this confession happened, that this meet-up happened. That's all we have. And Dowdall says, look, throughout this process, you've been calling me a liar, And he acknowledged that there were points in time where he had been proven a liar, where he had lied. "You said I lied before the Special Criminal Court," he said at one point. There were points in time where he had been proven to have lied, but he insisted, "What I'm telling now is the truth. And at the end of it, the truth is the truth. He told me he shot the kid and he met me in the park." And he insisted that that is the truth. He also made a mention about Colin Fox, deceased superintendent. He said the whole case was going to be based off Colin Fox if he didn't take the stand. I don't propose to talk about this much, but Mr. Fox was obviously the lead investigator originally. We didn't get into that, but ultimately Dowdall finished up by saying it's up to the judges in the chamber, and if they don't believe me, well, that's up to them. And that's where we kind of left it.
And he's absolutely right. It's the three judges. They're obviously eminent legal people, and they're sitting through the whole thing, and they will make the decision. So he's completely right there. There's no jury, it's three judges, and they have to, as I keep on saying, they will make findings about everything, and they will give a very considered judgment, and we'll see what they believe and what they disbelieve. But Paul, can just this is always something that interests me. His demeanour and that of Gerry Hutch. What was it like today? Was he, because I say 8 days is a really long time to be in the witness stand. How was he today as it went on?
I thought he was a little more measured, and towards the end, and again, it's like he was aware that we were coming to the end. Dowdall, I mean, that he wanted to get that point across. Look, I'm telling the truth, and if you don't believe me, so be it, but it's up to the judges to decide whether I'm telling the truth. And he was insistent upon that, and confident about that, and look, there were other days where he was much more frustrated. I would say that at this point in time, he was a bit more comfortable. He was aware that he was coming to the end of things, and he wanted to finish with that point that, look, I'm telling the truth. And when it came to Gerry Hutch, I think Hutch has been relaxed the whole way through this. I mean, he's just sitting there and he's looking at Jonathan Dowdall. Again, Dowdall doesn't look at Hutch. He never looked at him, not once. And when things finished up today, when he was finally confirmed to him that it is indeed over, his nightmare, I suppose, on the stand is over, he got up, he left the room. Again, he didn't look at Hutch. He walked out. And that was it. Thanks, Mr. Dowdall was the last thing Mr. Gretton said to him. I think it was hard for Dowdall to believe. He did seem a little shocked that it was over, but other than that, I would say generally speaking, he was more measured today. But he wasn't challenged as much until really the end of the day than maybe he had been on previous occasions.
And as we know, or as you said, when he has been given evidence, there have been several guarded detectives and a couple of prison officers he's in the jury box, so it's nice and spacious. Would that still be the case today?
Oh yeah, he's surrounded with his plainclothes members of Garda Síochána who have these earpieces in, and then there were several Irish Prison Service prison guards around him. The security presence has been high throughout all of this, as you know, Mick, and hasn't let up any day. But look, it's gone off, I suppose, without a hitch in terms of any security concerns. Obviously nothing happened in that regard, and the Gardaí would be relieved that they did their job impeccably. And that this high profile witness now goes back to Limerick prison to serve out the remainder of his sentence for facilitating the murder. We don't anticipate that we'll see him again. The prosecution would have had an opportunity to further question him if they wanted to, but Mr. Gillane indicated that he was finished with Mr. Dowdall as well. And
there is an irony that we've in relation to the Regency, we've heard the term emergency response unit, the Garda emergency response unit, which is the three men who dressed up as SWAT team members. The irony is that it's the Garda emergency response unit who are escorting Mr. Dowdall to and from prison. You see them in their Audi Q7s. So there's the fake ERU at the Regency, and then it's the real ERU who are protecting Mr. Dowdall to and from prison, or to and from the court.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, and then you have the armed response unit as well, don't you?
The security is very tight. So you have the armed response unit, who are sort of in between normal Gardaí and the emergency response. They're the sort of first responders, and they're uniformed. And you see them outside the court. They drive distinctive jeeps that have red markings on them to show they're armed, and it says Armed Support Unit on it. But then there's the emergency response unit, who would be a tier above that, and they provide the close protection. But there's very, very significant security. The ERU are there, are all the alphabets. ERU, the Armed Support Unit, and the Public Order Unit are there as well. So and the regular Gardaí. So that there's no messing with security.
Absolutely not. Well, look, it's been. I propose to leave it there. We're going to do a Q&A after this in a separate pod that we hope to have out tonight as well. But just want to say thanks for everyone for listening, for following. We've both had a lot of DMs from people, questions, which is why we're doing the Q&A. Even had a couple of people tap me on the shoulder in the last couple of days to say that they were listening in, which is great. So just want to say thanks and happy Christmas, and we'll be back in January.
Thanks very much, everybody.